Dear colleagues and all the guests here today, it's a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak to you on this occasion. My topic is somewhat dramatic, as you see, and I'm not going to spend much time on details of fisheries economics, but I'm going to more sort of look at the evolution and the political economy of the system that we have. In recent years, economists have come to believe that inefficient property rights are the fundamental cause of poverty in developing countries, not the lack of capital, which is a second-order constraint. High-income countries, therefore, almost by definition, have a relatively efficient structure of property rights in all critical economic sectors, but they can afford the luxury of inefficient institutions and minor activities. And the common fisheries policy of the EU is an institutional structure that deals with a minor activity. And to quote the title of a recent study of this structure, it is designed for failure. In Iceland, marine fisheries is the country's most important industry. A setback in the fisheries always brings economic crisis in the country. We are the only country in Europe that must have efficient structures in the fisheries to maintain high living standards. And we have developed a very efficient, effective institutions for the industry. According to the Norwegian Research Institute, NOFIMA, in Tromsø, the value added per Icelandic fisher is about 50% higher than the value added per fisher in Norway, in a report which they published last year. In this paper, I ask a simple question: why is the government of Iceland now, in the middle of the worst economic crisis in the history of the Republic, designing a new fishery system which introduces economic efficiency on a large number of margins? The outline of the paper. I begin with a brief outline of a framework and assumptions for examining why governments use the power of the state to change the structure of economic property rights. Who are the key players? Why do they demand institutional change? How much information do they have? How much do they know about economic systems? I also mention that modern history has seen a slow movement back and forth between what I call the macro paradigm and the macro paradigm and the micro paradigm. I'll explain this. I then identify 4 theoretical insights that are important for thinking about fisheries regulations. Next, I go to the Icelandic case and sort of apply this framework informally to explore why this demand for changes in the country's fisheries institutions has come about. I'm going to go sort of rather rapidly through this business, it's sort of common sense. Who are the players when we change institutions? Where is the source of demand for institutional change? First of all, there is the rule maker who actually makes the formal rules and the property rights. That's the government and its agencies. And the government, the state, supplies new property rights when it is in the interests of the ruler to do so. New property rights transfer valuable rights to people in specific social categories. I call them the right holders. Other citizens are required to respect the new institutions, the rights of the right holders. They are, I call them the duty bearers. A new system of institutions is stable when it serves the need of the right holders and is accepted by the duty bearers. I divide the duty bearers into 2 categories on the basis of their incentives to call for a new system. There are those who are doing so for strictly material reasons. Their economic interests call for a change, so to speak. I call them the materialists, for lack of a better word. And there are others who object to this system in ethical or moral terms, even though they are not directly involved with it. And I call them the ideologists. And then all three types may reject the system if it doesn't function properly in a technical sense. So that is that. Now, how much do they know? Do they have what is called instrumental rationality? Instrumental rationality is an understanding of how social systems work and the capacity to change them to meet the specific goals that we have. And I assume that we do not have satisfactory theories to fully understand social systems. If I would not assume that, we would all become unemployed here, all types of economists, including fisheries economists and the rest. So I do not, sometimes we know a lot, sometimes we know little, and often we are surprised. Then there is the story of this macro paradigm versus the micro-macro paradigms, how they kind of interact, and how there's a pendulum that over the last 200, 250 years goes sort of back and forth among policymakers to favor one approach more than the other, and then go back to the other, and then back again. What is the difference between these two approaches? The first one, the micro paradigm, is associated with decentralization, emphasis on incentives, individual incentives, believes in the ability of individuals to negotiate around market failures. Sometimes this belief is too strong. There is emphasis on information and the idea that it is scattered throughout society. And knowledge is also scattered throughout society, and emphasis on experiments, learning by doing, and adoption. The macro paradigm is associated more with central management, rejections of most of the beliefs that I just listed. The approach plays down the role of incentives, prefers top-down solutions, trusts that experts understand economic systems and know how to manipulate them from the center, and search and experimentation by producers, individual producers. This tends to disrupt central management. Dump over this here. The next thing I'm going to talk about are what I call 4 useful insights when we think about regimes of fisheries management. The first is what nature of efficient property rights. Property rights are about creating incentives that lead people to create wealth rather than waste resources. Rather, efficient property rights are about this, how to create incentives to lead people to create wealth instead of waste resources. I'm not going to spend much time on talking any more about property rights because others will do that later. But the property rights to function well must be clearly defined, secure, exclusive, and transferable. And then there is the Coase theorem, which states that when property rights are well defined and can be transferred at low cost, they tend to end up with those who use them most effectively in production. Transferability of rights is essential for maximizing the value of a resource. And then the third item is what I call the windfall gain principle, which is just simple common sense. It is not elaborate economic theory. It sort of states that when the government transfers valuable rights to individuals for free, the new owners receive windfall gains. Those who later buy the rights from the original owners do not share in the original gift. If the state changes its mind and wants the gift back, it cannot do so by charging second or third generation owners for the gift or claim it from them because they do not have it. The entire windfall is with the first generation. And then comes forth a very complex issue that I'm not going to dwell on, and that is the idea about resource rent and taxation on resource rent that originated with David Ricardo. This idea claims that you can tax rent without any implication for the allocation of resources, and therefore the tax is the perfect tax. One of the early people to object to this insight was Frank Knight, the American economist, and his argument is fairly elaborate, but the basic idea is that natural resources are not a stock variable, it is a flow. And natural resources are actually produced. They just don't sit there. And those who use the resources, they invest in discovery and experimentation. And if you tax away the rent fully, you tax away the incentive for producing a resource, so to speak. So this concept of there's sort of a piece of land in England that is owned by a nobleman is too simple for Frank Knight. And he just waits at home for the people to bring the rent to him. Then we come now to, finally to Iceland. Why is there demand for changing our fishery system? Where does it come from? And let's just go through the list. Is the design unworkable in a purely technical sense? If we think in terms of efficiency and protection of fish stocks. And there is not a huge opposition to the, or any significant opposition to the system on this narrow, in these narrow terms. The industry is by and large satisfied with the program. Then where does the opposition come from? It must come from the duty bearers. And there are two types of them, the materialists. I claim in this talk that there is a strong opposition from them, but they are a relatively small group in terms of all the voters. And they are not necessarily very powerful, but they are powerful. These are people who want to enter the fisheries without a license, and also communities that have lost quotas and been hurt by the structural changes that have taken place in the industry. These are real grievances, and we'll come back to them later. So there is this material opposition, but my main point is that the overwhelming opposition to the thing comes from the other class of duty bearers, those that I call the ideologists, who find the system illegitimate. These people do not sort of gain they gain indirectly, of course, on the basis of what kind of system we have, but they are not influenced directly by economic incentives. And for them to express their point of view, it has no consequences, so to speak, because my single point of view doesn't change any system, so to speak. So but the next question is, why is this lack of legitimacy so important in terms of influence? And I go through a few steps here. The first is that the introduction of the quota system that took place in 1983, 4 to 1990, was a rescue mission for an industry that was in deep crisis, struggling with overcapacity, poor organization, and dwindling fish stocks. The rescue could not involve at the time, new fees or taxes on the industry. The industry was broke. You don't rescue a broke industry by introducing new taxes. It was politically impossible, and it was economically impossible at the time. Then we jump a little bit and see when the system becomes successful. Or just to back up a little bit, initially the quotas had little value. Sometimes they were passed on between family members with little or no payment. In formal exchange, initially the quota price was low until the market recognized the new system's potential for wealth creation. Suddenly, everyone realized what magnitudes were involved. People were startled. Quite ordinary neighbors had, through the free quotas, become millionaires in dollars. Like many small places, Iceland has a culture of equality. And like many former colonies, the Icelanders are drawn to what has been called an opposition paradigm. Let's do it our way, not the way of the colonial masters, which meant in our case applying the macro paradigm. After World War II, economic liberalization came much later in Iceland than in other Nordic countries. Then opposition had cooled somewhat, as one can see from opinion polls, when we sort of come into the early 2000s, the first decade of the new century. But then there are two shocks that hit us, so to speak. It hit the political equilibrium. One is the verdict of the UN Human Rights Commission, and the other is the big financial crisis. And these shocks rekindled the dislike of the quota system. Okay. The last opinion poll, national opinion poll of reasonably high quality, although one cannot take them too seriously, is from 2007. And it's interesting to look at what did the voters want then in a national Gallup poll. 25% of the respondents wanted to abolish the ITQ system entirely. When asked what they wanted instead, the most common answer was aggregate quotas, where the fishers compete to finish the quota. And we know this is sometimes now called Olympic races that are incredibly inefficient. The second most popular alternative was open access. This is also known as tragedy of the commons, another sort of not very good answer. 66% of those asked wanted to reform the system. When asked what reforms they wanted, 70% of those people didn't have an answer. 15% wanted regional quotas, and 15% wanted to stop the transfer of quotas. This is in terms of the 60%, so there is about 9–10% of the nation who are demanding these changes, if you look at the whole nation. There are some additional statistics from the 2007 poll. 15% of the voters want the current system without any major changes, only 15%. They prefer the status quo. No political party does, in no political party does the majority of the voters want the current system without change. There are relatively small differences in views between the voters of the different parties. Sjálfstæðisflokkur, center-right, 23% prefer the status quo. Samfylking, center-left, 11% prefer the status quo. Again, Sjálfstæðisflokkur, 20% of Sjálfstæðisflokkur, center-right, want to abolish the system altogether. In Samfylking, center-left, 34%. So there is a difference, but these differences are not dramatic. There's not a majority in any party for status quo. And there is not much difference between electoral districts, and there is not much difference between Reykjavik and other parts of the country, which means that this opposition is ideological more than materially based. And now we go through the political history of the system. I have already sort of touched on it. It originates in formally in 1990. It is introduced by a center-left government. The center-right votes against the proposal. The industry is divided and hesitant. In the second half of the 1990s, the success becomes obvious. Sjálfstæðisflokkur now defends the system. Opposition to it becomes a focal point for the leaders of the left center. And the fisheries entrepreneurs become labeled as thieves. And if you want to get your enemies down, you associate them with the country's basic industry. Then come the financial shock, the 2009 election that involves a paradigm shift in politics and economics. We have the first center-left coalition in the history of the republic. The two leaders of the coalition who were in the government that introduced the system in 1990 make a priority of changing it or reforming it. This is a little bit like a Greek tragedy where the king and the queen killed their own baby because they didn't recognize it. But then we have reform bills in 2011 and 2012 that, and now I'm not going to dwell on the details of these reforms. We don't know what will eventually come out of them, but they have certain common features, these suggestions. There is a disregard of economic incentives, lack of concern for potential political abuse in allocation of the fisheries resource, and somewhat surprisingly, shoddy workmanship in just working out the details of what the policymakers want to do. Which sort of, to some extent, surprised me when I started to look into this matter. Let's just sort of go quickly through the reform. The reforms go beyond collecting rent on behalf of the state from the industry. But there is an introduction, the very high taxes are proposed, and there is overconfidence overconfidence that the central government has the technical capacity to measure and remove the resource rent and leave all firms with normal profits. A huge license fee is introduced without first thinking about the need to find reliable data and a satisfactory method of calculating the tax. And we leave out entirely the principle of windfall gains, which I mentioned before, but just the whole task is not handled very well. So when you sort of look at the proposal, and it is based on using 2-year-old figures and updating them, if you sort of go back in time and say, if this rule had been in use some time ago, a few years ago, what would the tax have been like? And it turns out that it would have been over 100%. And you're talking about the basic industry in the country at a time of supreme crisis. And you have this quality of workmanship and this capacity, or audacity rather, to completely throw it up in air without doing the homework even. You know, it's really startling why something like this can take place by people that I don't think for one second intend to harm the country in any way. It has something to do with a different version, different view, different mindset when they look at the problem than I have, for instance. Okay, so one characteristic of the system is to reduce the allowable total catch that goes to the old system, to the quota system, and channel it into different pots, as they were called at one point, or still called, that are by and large in the hands of politicians. At the margin of the new system, Yeah, and there is an obvious dislike of the use of collaterals, and there is a whole literature about the importance of collaterals for economic development. That is to be abolished gradually. Transfer, they don't like transfer and flexibility. And the reason why it is not removed immediately is that they're concerned about bankruptcy. They understand that. But the plan is, after 20 years, that there will be no transfer of the quotas between the fishers and the ships. And at the margin of the system are all kinds of little things, toy things that are supposed to have good regional consequences, and some of them are very funny because they remind you of stories that were told about Reykjavik in the years after World War II when everything was regulated here. There is something called coastal fisheries, and there the minister decides on what days the fishers can go out and what time of the day they can go out. There is another sort of branch of small boating, so to speak, where the minister decides that when they bait the hooks, they have to use their hands. They cannot use equipment to do that. And there is a proposal that when the industry thinks that the price of fresh fish is very high in Europe, for instance, the minister can impose a tax on the exports to prevent it. Thereby creating not value added but value reduced. And these are sort of like, stories that one used to hear from old days in Reykjavik and certain parts of Eastern Europe in the old days. And so there is sort of like an enormous role for central management and detailed control, and a fundamental dislike of anything that has to do with flexibility, economic incentives, and so on. And the whole thing is moved in the direction of central control. There's also another interesting thing, that in this whole movement, this legitimacy movement, the sort of coordinating idea is that the resources in the ocean are the property of all Icelanders. Okay, now we are going to tax the industry very, very heavily, collect the money for the people, and where is it going? How do you let the Icelanders who all own it benefit from it? Well, there is an undertone in the legislation or in the proposals that fishing districts in the countryside will get a very large share of this money, provided that they are outside Reykjavik, and communities that have no fishing will not benefit. That was at least in the 2011 proposal. And so it is basically, this story about that it belongs to the nation. It has just turned into a story of political handouts for individual politicians involving the districts. There is no interest whatsoever in the country or in the government or in the opposition, for that matter, to somehow turn this into, say, individual shares, like what's done in Alaska, where when discovered oil, everybody receives once a year a paycheck that is part of the return of the citizen on the natural resources in Alaska. There is no interest in this. There's not much thought going on in this, so to speak, or perhaps there is, but I missed it. So this is the last slide. There is the unavoidable origins of the system and the transfer shock when people saw how much was involved. In retrospect, it probably was a mistake not to step in with some kind of modest taxes to indicate or to cool the feelings, so to speak. I am willing to sort of think about that at least. Then the dislike of the system becomes like a cultural symbol, just like symbols in religions and so on. And it becomes sort of path dependent. This happens sometimes. There was somebody told me in a place in a road plan in Indiana in the United States that became sort of a symbol like this, and nobody knows anything why the road is good or bad, but this either for or against the idea. Then we get a new government after the crash and this UN verdict, which I don't have time to speak about, and we get a new government with two elderly leaders who are steeped in a macro paradigm. And then you have this worldwide crash and the impact of that, both in Iceland and elsewhere, that the whole system is moving. Now it feels that it went too far in the direction of the micro paradigm and this wants to go back. So in conclusion, I want to, there is sort of like a disclaimer in the end that I'm a little bit biased. And I spent 2 years with Eleanor Ostrom in Bloomington, Indiana, who is she's unfortunately has died now, World Authority on the use of natural resources. And the whole approach and the entire thinking about this, these two bills, bills of 2011 and 12, 4 bills altogether, is that they're doing everything that she told me that one should not do. And that's why I'm biased. Thank you.